guys, what's going on? You are listening to This Week in Geek, otherwise known as the flagship of stupidity. I am your host, Mike the Birdman Dodd. And well, guys, I am back on the show. As you can guess, it has been a interesting little while in the TWIG archives of weirdness, but I'm glad to be back, and I am back with a bang this afternoon. I have a very special treat for you. As you guys know, I am a fan of horror movies, specifically the 80s style of horror movies, from the inventiveness of David Cronenberg to people like John Carpenter, Stuart Gordon, Joe Dante, Mick Garris, the list goes on. And I recently found out through a channel that I watch called Good Bad Flicks about a documentary called In Search of Darkness, which is about the 80s horror movie scene from 1980 going all the way up to 1989. So we're talking Jason, Freddy, and Michael Myers, Chucky, Pinhead, Pumpkinhead. There is a deep cut. And I found out about this documentary, and we have on the line with us this afternoon the director of this movie, David Weiner, and we're going to talk about the 80s, the horror movies, some of the cool people he got a chance to talk to in making this 4.5-hour documentary happen, which has its premiere, or will have premiered, at Fantastic Fest this weekend, correct?
Beyond Fest.
Yeah, at Beyond Fest this weekend, so you can look forward to a full review. Well, when this interview goes up, it'll be already been premiered. So I'll say this: go out and buy the damn thing. It's awesome. But let's talk about it. So, David, when this idea came to your head, how did you decide to focus on 80s horror? Because you could have covered the stuff in the 50s and 60s and 70s with the kind of Hammer stuff. You could have covered the 90s revival. What makes the 80s horror movie scene stand out as something that people, when they think of a horror movie, they automatically think Jason, Freddy, Chucky, etc.?
Well, my background is as a through and through monster kid. I watched the Universal horror films. I watched the Hammer films. I watched Godzilla movies growing up, and I was a big fan and reader of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, and then Fangoria after that. I ended up becoming the editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine at some point. And this project came my way because executive producer Robin Block thought of this idea. He said, I want to do a nostalgia trip through the 80s and cover as many 80s horror movies as we can, because this decade is a seismic shift in the way horror movies were made. Practical effects were really hitting their zenith in terms of technology and creativity, and that confluence with the video revolution, whether it was the video stores and VHS or cable TV, lots of movies were able to be made by skirting the studio system and going straight to video. So there was an absolute explosion of creativity by indie filmmakers, and that really kind of defined an entirely different decade than what we had seen before.
So when you started putting this together and you started looking at who you could talk about this, you talk with a lot of different directors. You talk with Joe Dante, you talk with Mick Garris, you talk with John Carpenter. Who were some of the people in this documentary that you wanted to get their perspectives on this genre? Because a lot of directors during this time got their early starts and now have gone on to, without putting too fine a point on it, much more prestigious projects, but they still love their horror roots.
Well, you make an interesting point. A lot of these directors they cut their teeth on horror, and then they went on to more prestigious filmmaking. Cronenberg is a perfect example of that. While others, they got their start and they decided to stay in that track. John Carpenter is a great example of that. Although he did veer every now and then, he would zig or zag with something like Starman or Big Trouble in Little China, which were different genre films, but also still within a genre trappings. And it was a real pleasure to be able to talk to a wonderful cross-section of filmmakers, writers, actors, practical effects masters, composers, horror journalists. We wanted everyone to be able to tell the story of 80s horror, not only from looking back and the contemporary perspective on that decade, but also from the people who were there and how they had to maneuver through the inner workings of the system to get their dream and vision made.
One of the people that you spoke to was a person who unfortunately passed away, and your movie is dedicated towards, and that's Larry Cohen, the guy most notably known for doing Q, the Winged Serpent, and The Stuff. What was it like getting his perspective? Because he'd been in the industry for so long.
He was such a wonderful interview, and we really miss Larry because he was salt of the earth, very straightforward type of person, and he was an absolute creative force, and produced really well known television shows, films in a variety of different genres, but he also carved a path in the horror genre, and so his approach to stuff was very much, I'm going to do it all myself so I could have complete creative control and do anything I want within a limited budget. But he also had the business savvy to convince the studios to give him money to make his movies, and also to make more than one movie oftentimes. And so he's one of those few filmmakers where he would make a deal with a studio saying, these are the movies I want to make. And they had absolute trust that he would deliver. So they would oftentimes just give him the entire budget and say, here you go, make us a film, deliver it. Whereas a lot of other filmmakers, it's an entirely different and less trusting process. So it was real fun to get his straightforward and approach to things, but also he has just such a wonderful dry sense of humor, and I could tell that he was enjoying talking about his career.
Another director that kind of follows the same kind of through line as Larry was director Lloyd Kaufman. What was it like talking with him, considering how he's a very powerful independent filmmaker as well?
Well, that's an interview that our executive producer Robin Block did. Robin lives in England, in London, and he flew to the East Coast to get a couple interviews, and Lloyd was one of them. And Lloyd showed him around the Troma Studios, treated him like a friend. And once we sat him down and he started talking about his career, he is all over the map. It's very entertaining getting his perspective because he's also kind of a one-man show. And, Troma really went outside the studio system to make, create, and produce their own films. And they picked a genre that they knew would work. And getting his insight on how you could do it all in one room, essentially, was quite enlightening.
So to kind of switch gears a little bit, you've also mentioned that you got a chance to talk with some of the actors involved in some of these horror movies, and you got a chance to talk with Kelly Maroney, you talked with Barbara Crampton, Kane Hodder, Doug Bradley. What were some of the cool experiences you got from talking with these people? Because you're talking to Pinhead, you're talking to some of the original Scream Queens, etc.
Well, it's real fun for me. I've been doing this for quite some time. My background includes interviewing celebrities and filmmakers and creative folks back in Entertainment Tonight prior to my Famous Monsters days. Wow. And what I always really seek out is first of all, it's always a wonderful scenario to be able to sit down with someone where they're just sitting down for you, as opposed to catching them at a convention or you get 5 or 10 minutes at a junket. So here they could relax, you could sort of ease into it. They not only talk about their own films in our film, but they get to talk about their favorites. And they get to geek out like we all do as audience members on movies that really influenced them and movies that made a real impact on them, but also movies that they don't like or scared the crap out of them. That's always really fun stuff. And I found everyone to be extremely forthright, candid, but I wanted everyone to enjoy themselves. I wanted the emotion, the visceral, impact of what these people experience to come through in their interviews. And I believe we captured some of that.
What were some things that surprised you that maybe came out of these interviews? Are there any stories you didn't expect or any opinions you didn't expect to see come out?
Well, there's countless, because as you could see, I delivered a 4-hour, 20-minute movie, which is obviously the short version. So much on the cutting room floor. And I think, unfortunately, the format, because you want to keep things going because there's so much ground to cover in this decade, You really couldn't necessarily slow down for some of the longer stories, which I got. But I really enjoyed talking to Kane Hodder, talking about how important it was to take on the mantle of playing Jason when he got on Friday the 13th Part 7. John Buechler had absolute faith in him, having worked before with him as a stuntman. And the prior actor was absolutely fine, but Buechler wanted to have Kane Hodder. So when Kane Hodder, he describes that first scene and what it meant to him when he first put on that mask, and especially in Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, he talks about that scene that they shot at Times Square where Jason sort of takes the stage, so to speak, he felt like an absolute rock star. And he decided never to take off his mask that entire night because he didn't want to ruin the illusion. Those are real fun stories for me.
That's something I wish, because I was a child when Part 8 came out. I wish I could have been in New York to see that day, because that's such an iconic shot of the camera panning around Jason, seeing Times Square, and that's such a slice in time too. It's such a difference seeing Times Square in Basket Case to Times Square in this. Like, wow, commercialization versus you can get meth here.
Yeah, well, I grew up in New York, outside of New York City. I grew up in Westchester, and New York. Growing up in the '70s as a kid, Times Square was not the place you wanted to go. Times Square was the place that you wanted to avoid. But they in the '80s they really cleaned it up, and they really turned it into a destination that was safe and clean and. I think obviously I believe it's for the better, but like you say, there's a certain time capsule captured in movies like Basket Case and even Friday the 13th Part 8, where you see New York of a different time. Although we all know that that's the only shot that they shot in New York in Jason Takes Manhattan, because Jason essentially took Toronto for that film.
Yeah, because I remember, I think they shot most of the external scenes in Vancouver.
Vancouver. Thank you. Or is it Vancouver or Toronto? Either way,
I think it was Vancouver. Yeah,
the whole time.
Yeah, but he did get to kill someone with a guitar, which was interesting.
Yes, a theme that we see, because there's also a guitar killing in Psycho 3. So maybe there's some. Go ahead. and Slumber Party Massacre, 2 or 3 as well.
I think
I'm getting tangential here.
So when you were putting this together, what movies did you discover that you'd never seen before? Because you'd covered so many ones. Like, I actually sent Alex, the engineer for this episode, a list of stuff like, dude, we have to find these movies. Like Ghost Story, without putting too fine a point on it, I'm just going to say it, looks fucking so cool. Or The Burning looks awesome.
Well, you mentioned, The Burning is definitely one that was never on my radar. And so I've always been a huge fan of Tom Savini and Tom Savini's work, but The Burning just never crossed my threshold. And so that was a real fun one to discover. And another one that I completely missed when it came out was Brian Yuzna's Society. And that's one I really discovered in the course of making this film. I'd heard of it, but I never really knew much about it. And people would say, Society, this is important. And the fact that we got to talk to Brian Yuzna, of course, I had to investigate. And once you see the shunting, you can't turn back. It's crossing a very, very distinct line in your world.
Yeah, I've seen the clip from your movie, and it's to the point where, well, I'm never going to look at that the same way again. So slimy. One of the other cool things, you got a chance to talk to composers. You talked to Harry Manfredini. You also got to talk to John Carpenter. What did you learn about horror movie scores? Because I never realized that horror has a very distinct sound, and it really builds the movie in a separate way than, say, your typical action movie soundtrack.
Well, one of my favorite sections of the movie is talking about sound design and the composer's scores, and being able to sort of compare and contrast some. Because, for every John Carpenter score, which is a synth-driven score, for Hellraiser or for The Fly, you have these bombastic bombastic orchestral scores. Yeah, I can't say that. Orchestral scores. For some reason, I lost my ability to articulate this. But even with Slumber Party Massacre 3, that thing was made on like a $30 Casio and a bunch of champagne glasses that they'd like to ping. And it still works, And, like in discovering the journey through the music element of these films, I think a lot of people maybe don't necessarily pay attention to like the Halloween 3 score, which is a really great score that John Carpenter collaborated on. And what did I learn? I learned it was really nice to be able to get, like Nick Castle, who plays the Shape in the original Halloween and also is the director of The Last Starfighter, was in a band with Carpenter. And so he knows Carpenter's approach to these things. And Halloween was done by Carpenter because it was simply a budgetary constraint that he said, I'll just do this myself. And then he decided he wanted to continue doing it for, most of his films. Ironically, if you look at The Thing with Ennio Morricone, that's really very Carpenter-esque, but it's not actually done by Carpenter. So what did I learn? I think it's really interesting to know the approach to not only the connection between sound design and the music itself, and how it's layered in to really, really sort of choreograph what's going on the screen. I think you pay that much more attention to it when we discuss it.
One of the other things that your documentary covers, you talk to some of the fandom, not just from print media such as Fangoria, but you also talk to websites like The Daily Dead. You talk to Cecil Trachtenberg from Good Bad Flicks, James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd. What was it like getting the perspective of these hardcore superfans? And you even got Corey Taylor from Slipknot.
Corey Taylor from Slipknot was a mystery backer. He was just one of the backers of our project, and there was a level where if you sponsored at a certain level, you got to actually be in this movie. And it turned out to be Corey Taylor, who is just an absolute horror nut and incredibly charismatic and knowledgeable. And so that was just a serendipitous surprise. But I think what's really important and crucial and relevant with these like YouTube creators is that they're curators for a whole new generation who might know these films exist, but they don't know much about them. And so they are very knowledgeable about these movies and have very strong opinions and know the beats and the ins and outs of all these movies. So, whether it's Cecil or James Rolfe or James A. Janice, Heather Wixon, they just know these movies back and forth, and they really helped me sort of fill out the corners of the story that I was telling with this film. And they definitely make a wonderful portal for a whole new generation to discover these movies.
I gotta say, one of the things that I've definitely enjoyed while watching this movie, like I said, over the course of its 4.5-hour runtime, I felt connected to these movies in a way that I never thought I really like. I was amazed about how much of the stuff I actually knew, but seeing it presented to me, I connected to it more. Like I realized, like, hey, you're the girl from Chopping Mall. You're the girl who got head from the Reanimator movie. So that's weird. Or I saw you
head scene, yes.
Or I saw you naked From Beyond. I felt the love of the movies, the genre. And I realized how much I really connect to horror as a fan. And this is something I recommend to anybody who wants to get into understanding what makes horror movies so exciting. Like there's a community out there that goes to these horror conventions. Like there's one in Detroit that I know is huge. You can go to these theme parks that celebrate the horror movies. Like there's like a Ghostbusters experience. There's the Universal Monster Nights. Stuff like that. So I guess my final question to you, David, is what is the biggest thing you hope people walk away from this documentary? With me, it's renewing my love of this genre to make me seek out new content. I want to see Maniac. I want to see Motel Hell. I want to see The Burning like yesterday.
Well, that's the thing. There's a joy to this that I think if you didn't have it or it was on a low flame, it's sparked again. I think when you watch this movie, you really want to immediately afterwards go revisit and discover the new ones that you became aware of, and revisit your favorites. And I think what is a greater good that this film does, and I won't lay claim to creating this myself. I think it's intrinsic to the content. Is that when we look back at these movies, they meant a lot to all of us. If you're a fan, we each saw some movie at some point when probably we were too young, and it made an incredible impression on us, and pretty much sparked an obsession. And going through looking at these, you kind of remember, oh yeah, this is the reason why I love this stuff. And if you're not a big fan of horror, but you're always kind of curious about what the hoopla is about, I think this hopefully gives, it sort of pulls back the curtain, opens up the door on why people are so enthusiastic about this stuff. Because a lot of people perceive horror as, if they don't love the genre, as it's all just blood and guts and nudity and sex and horrific material. And why would you subject yourself to this? And I think this will open your eyes as to why we love this so much, because there's craft, there's heart, there's real kinetic connection to these movies that is very unlike any other genre.
So, final question, for real this time. What else do you have coming up in the future? And if people wanted to get this documentary, how would they go about doing so?
Well, if you are interested in this documentary, you go to 80shorrordoc.com, 80s, 80shorrordoc.com, starting October 7th, starting this coming Monday. We are making it available to everybody. So this is a crowd-funded project, and it's going to all the backers, but we want to make it available to everyone. And then after that, we will figure out the wider distribution elements. But anyone can get it for a limited time, only in October, at 80shorrordoc.com. And up next, I'm working with Robin Block again, and we are putting together another film that is 80s-centric, and it's called In Search of Tomorrow, and it's all about 80s sci-fi movies.
We are so going to be talking again. You don't have a choice in this matter. I'm excited. David, thank you so much for taking time out of your exceptionally busy schedule.
Well, thank you so much for spreading the good horror word. And I'm so glad you enjoyed this. And I hope everyone can seek this out and enjoy it themselves as well. Take care.
All right, guys, that was my interview with David Weiner, the director of the In Search of Darkness, the 80s horror documentary. Please seek this out. It's available on Monday, October 7th. You should see this. It's some of the best horror movie documentaries I've seen, very much in line with Never Sleep Again, Crystal Lake Memories. His name is Jason. If you like 80s horror, seek this out, because odds are you're going to go on a spending spree on Amazon looking for most of these movies that they show clips from. Trust me on that one. So anyway, guys, until next time, I've been your host, Mike the Birdman Dodd, saying live free or die hard, and I'll catch you next time right here on ThisWeekInGeek.net.
Well, that's our show.
All right, here's the deal. Every time you watch my show, I will send you $40.
Checks will not be honored.
You've been listening to This Week in Geek, your source for guaranteed nonsense or your money back. Tune in next week for more info on the most important things you didn't need to know. Check out our website at ThisWeekInGeek.net and subscribe to our podcast through iTunes or any podcatcher. If you'd like to comment on this episode, head over to this episode's post at ThisWeekInGeek.net and leave a comment through Facebook Connect. Follow us on Twitter at ThisWeekInGeek.net and follow our Instagram at twig_official_podcast. Social media not your thing? Send us an email at feedback@thisweekingeek.net. We'll see you next time, and remember,
lower your shields and surrender your listenership.
Just when you think this show is terrible, something wonderful happens.
What?
It ends.
I have to go. Somewhere there is a crime happening.